The Canadian Bill of Rights. An act for the recognition and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The Parliament of Canada, affirming that the Canadian nation is founded upon principles that acknowledge the supremacy of God, the dignity and worth of the human person, and the position of the family in a society of free men and free institutions, affirming also that men and institutions remain free only when freedom is founded upon respect for moral and spiritual values and the rule of law, and being desirous of enshrining these principles and the human rights and fundamental freedoms derived from them in a Bill of Rights which shall reflect the respect of Parliament for its constitutional authority and which shall ensure the protection of these rights and freedoms in Canada. Therefore, Her Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate and House of Commons of Canada, enacts as follows. Article 1, Bill of Rights. It is hereby recognized and declared that in Canada there have existed and shall continue to exist without discrimination by reason of race, national origin, color, religion or sex, the following human rights and fundamental freedoms. Namely, now notice that they said namely, the right of the individual to life, liberty, security of the person, and enjoyment of property, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except by due process of law. The right of the individual to equality before the law, and the protection of the law. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and association, and freedom of the press. The Canadian Bill of Rights was enacted for the protection of the human rights and fundamental freedoms. And it says that in the Canadian Bill of Rights, it says that Canada, the nation, is founded upon the supremacy of God. The supremacy of God. Now once again, it doesn't qualify who or what God, it just states it's the supremacy of God that Canada is founded on. In the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have that same qualification. In the preamble, it states that Canada recognizes the supremacy of God. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Now, there is a God of the Judeo-Christian belief. There is a God of the Buddhist or Eastern mythology belief. There are gods, many of them, in Hinduism belief. So we'd like to know what God is Canada founded upon. If we do a little bit of research, we'll find out that it is indeed the God of what they consider the Holy Bible. The Holy Bible. Whether it being a Catholic or Protestant, that doesn't really matter. It's the fact that it's the God of the Holy Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament. This is a King James Holy Bible. It was my study Bible. It's pretty much falling apart. I've studied this book and all the books associated that have been termed Holy Bible for quite a while in my life to see what it had to say in there. Now, I know that book in here and in here. Her Majesty the Queen has taken control of all of Canada, the landmass, and the resources, such as oil, gas, gold, food, animals, trees, the land. I could keep going on. But she seized everything here in Canada. All natural resources now are in her control. That's what the law says. Now, Her Majesty, the Queen, says that God told her to do this, and that God gave her the authority to do this. And she also says that the God that she recognizes and serves is the one of King James. or if you will say the Catholic Bible also nowadays. But nevertheless, it's the Holy Bible. And in any Holy Bible that you read, you will never see an instruction where either the God of the Old Testament or Jesus Christ in the New Testament ever gave a commandment or authority to someone called Her Majesty the Queen to control a landmass and the people called Canada. And if you can find it in the Bible, well, you are more than welcome to email it to me. I guarantee you, you will not find that concept in the Bible. But nevertheless, that is what the Queen, or that is what the law says, Her Majesty the Queen has said, that God told her, or gave her the authority to lay hold upon all the natural resources that He created and placed here in Canada. In the Canadian Bill of Rights, Article 1, it states that it's recognized and declared that in Canada there have existed, past tense, and shall continue to exist, present and future tense, without discrimination. Without discrimination. So the Bill of Rights says that it's recognized and it has been declared that there have been and there shall always exist the following human rights and fundamental freedoms. And then they say, namely, and then they enumerate them. They list some fundamental rights and freedoms. Now they use this word here, namely. That's how they qualified the list. Because they're not enclosing, this list that they're about to mention is not all the human rights and freedoms that are available here in Canada. They're just certain rights and freedoms. That's why they said, namely, these rights and freedoms, meaning it's not a complete list. Bill of Rights, Article 5, Savings. Nothing in the Part 1 shall be construed to abrogate or abridge any human right or fundamental freedom not enumerated therein, that may have existed in Canada at the commencement of this Act. Canadian Bill of Rights, Part 1, recognizes, and it is declared, that there have and shall always exist freedoms and rights, fundamental freedoms and rights. And in Part 1, namely, these freedoms. And they tell you what freedoms. Canadian Bill of Rights, Article 5, nothing in Part 1, here, shall be construed to remove any human right or freedom not enumerated therein. So anything that's listed in here, in Part 1, if you're missing your human rights and freedoms that you find in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms, or in the International Covenants of Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights, or the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, if those freedoms for the human is not listed, enumerated in here, then it still exists in Canada, because it says that even though it's not enumerated herein, Canada does recognize the fact that these rights and freedoms are still in operation in Canada. So nothing in Part 1 here can be construed to remove any human right or freedom not enumerated therein. So you still have your rights and freedoms, even though it may not be listed in that list there. And it says that these rights and freedoms that existed in Canada before this Act was created. So before this Act was created here, the Canadian Bill of Rights in 1960, there were other rights and freedoms that were in operation for Canadians, or for men and women, here in the landmass called Canada. Now subsequent to this, you see this operation of law saying, again, we cannot strip you of your fundamental rights and freedoms. We try to, but we cannot. In the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Article 26, you see the same operation of the law. It says, in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms itself, it enumerates, it articulates certain rights and freedoms that are existing here in Canada thanks to the Charter itself. However, in the Charter, it states that it is also recognized that in Canada there are other rights and freedoms that are not enumerated, not articulated in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that Canada does recognize. Now, here in the Canadian Bill of Rights, you see the same operation of law. It states certain rights and freedoms that this bill will recognize, and it also states within the bill or the enactment that whatever rights and freedoms that you still have as a human that you do not see enumerated here, they are still in operation for you to use. To look for the other rights and freedoms that Canada does recognize, that have existed in Canada and shall forever exist in Canada, you need to look in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now, if you look in Canada, in the acts and the regulations, it's a federal act. It's called the Emergency Act. I shared a video about the Emergency Act here on YouTube. If you look into this act, you're going to see that in that act, in the preamble, it says that Canada states that it has obligations, legal obligations and accountability to the civil and political covenant. Canada is bound to that covenant. So all the human rights and freedoms and all the promises that you find in this covenant, Canada is under obligation to fulfill them, no matter what, even in a time of emergency. However, it's just interesting to see that Canada does indeed acknowledge that there are other rights and freedoms here in operation in Canada, and within their own act, they show us an example, they quote to us an example of where we can draw these other rights and freedoms, by stating that Canada has the obligation in this act to make sure it follows this. So we learned from that operation of law that whatever this is, civil and political rights, it has a lot of power, because Canada wants to make an enactment, a legislative power, a rule. However, this political rights and civil freedoms are overriding what they can make in the Emergency Act. Now I'll rephrase that again. When Canada proceeds, or was wanting to proceed, to make the Emergencies Act, this International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights had superior power or superior authority over the legislative power to make the act. The legislator was under the, if you will say, restriction to make sure whatever laws he created stayed within the framework of the Civil and Political Rights Covenant. So that's teaching us that there is a lot of accountability on Canada's part to these covenants. And it would be a wise thing to start to study these covenants, because in these covenants is where you find the complete expression of the human rights and freedoms and the obligations of the state parties, including Canada, to these contracts, to these laws and operations of law. Subsequent to the Bill of Rights, every other province has a human rights code or law that's in operation. And when you begin to study these human rights codes or these human rights laws that are in operation, it's a specific enactment, it's a specific statute, if you will. Some are called codes. They're not termed statutes, but nevertheless, there's laws that are enacted here in Canada and in each province. When you look into them, they'll enumerate and they mention certain rights and freedoms. Certain. Each province is the same. Just like you see in the bill, a Canadian Bill of Rights, and you see in the Canadian Charter of Rights, you'll see it in each and every province. They'll list and they'll enumerate certain rights and freedoms of the human beings, and then they'll try to qualify them through the legal person. But then also within the act or the enactment or the human code, it'll state that, it'll qualify and state that there are other rights and freedoms for the human being, fundamental rights and freedoms that are not listed or enumerated in this code, and they are in operation for you. So that same wording, that same operation of law that you see in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Article 26, that you will see in the Canadian Bill of Rights, Article 5, you'll see it in the Quebec Charter of Human Rights, also Article 50. You'll see it also in the Manitoba Human Rights Code. It's all throughout the law. Ontario Human Rights Code. Ontario Human Rights Code. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. and is in accord with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as proclaimed by the United Nations. And whereas these principles have been confirmed in Ontario by a number of enactments by the legislator, and it is desirable to revise and extend the protection of human rights in Ontario. British Columbia Human Rights Code. Code prevails. If there is a conflict between this code and any other enactment, this code prevails. British Columbia. Manitoba, the Human Rights Code. Whereas Manitobans recognize the individual worth and dignity of every member of the human family, and this principle underlies the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and other solemn undertakings, international and domestic, that Canadians honor. Much discrimination is rooted in ignorance, and education is essential to its eradication, and therefore it is important that human rights educational programs assist Manitobans to understand all their fundamental rights and freedoms, as well as their corresponding duties and responsibilities to others, and these various protections for the human rights of Manitobans are of such fundamental importance that they merit paramount status over all other laws of the province. You hearing that? There's such importance that they merit paramount status over all other laws of the province. This code is binding on Her Majesty in the right of Manitoba, unless expressively provided otherwise herein or in another act of the legislator. The substantive rights and obligations in this code are paramount over the substantive rights obligations in every other act of the legislator, whether enacted before or after this code. Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. Whereas every human being possesses intrinsic rights and freedoms designed to ensure his protection and development. Article 1. Every human being has a right to life and to personal security, inviolability, and freedom. Article 50. No suppression of right. The Charter shall not be so interpreted as to suppress or limit the enjoyment or exercise of any human right or freedom not enumerated herein. In the human right codes in the provinces, they mention the Universal Declaration of Human Rights within the code itself. And they mention the fact that we have our fundamental freedoms flowing from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Actually, in Manitoba, the Human Rights Code in Manitoba very, very nicely expresses it. The Human Rights Code, Manitoba. The preamble states this: Manitobans recognize individual worth. And these principles and the other principles that underlines the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now listen to this wording: and other solemn undertakings, such as international or domestic. Well, the International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They're saying Manitobans recognize it. So here they're stating the UDHR and those two international covenants, that Canada honors them. Manitoba, the Human Rights Code, the preamble, Section D. It states, discrimination is rooted in ignorance, and education is essential to the eradication of this ignorance and of this discrimination. Therefore, it is important that human rights education programs, listen to this, assist Manitobans to understand all their fundamental rights and freedoms. That's the preamble to this code. It states that the government is under obligation to teach you and help you understand what your human rights and freedoms are. Now I hope there are some Manitobans that have been watching my YouTube channel and that have slowly began to understand their rights and freedoms as a human being compared to the legal person, where they can sit back and say, yes, I agree, Manitoba did not fulfill this obligation, because if it had not been for these videos, I wouldn't have even known about my human rights and freedoms. But this is ridiculous. So, and they say, now listen to this, it says that discrimination is rooted in ignorance. It's true. I'm experiencing it. I get emails from people who do not like what I'm sharing here, and they are ignorant of the laws. They are ignorant of their place in Canada. I don't get mad at them. I treat them with mercy. But when you read the declarations and you begin to see what they say in it, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms, for example, it says that when you don't keep these principles in your mind, it talks about barbarous acts and the way you'll treat another brother because you don't have that respect and these principles operating in you. I see it in expression. Same thing here. It talks about discrimination and ignorance being placed upon you because of the fact that they don't understand their human rights and freedoms. And you do, and you share it, but they can't accept it because they haven't been taught it. And imagine here, it says that the government was under obligation to have educational programs. Educational programs, listen to that. To teach you, or teach Manitobans, their fundamental rights and freedoms. Well, go to eternallyware.com, go to the take-home DVD page, and there you can get some educational programs in DVD forms that will help you to learn your fundamental rights and freedoms. And if you are someone in the position of power in Manitoba that happens to come across this video, well, you guys have failed in your position to educate the men and women down there concerning their fundamental rights and freedoms. In fact, you've stripped them of their fundamental rights and freedoms by making them become legal persons under law. So you are also welcome to order my videos and to distribute them, one per family for Manitoba, eternallyware.com. And therefore you will fulfill the obligation that you need to fulfill according to your own charter. Knowing and understanding your rights and freedoms, knowing these as a man or a woman, it's very important. It's very important to your character. It's very important to who you are in your position in Canada, if you will understand. Because right now, the way you've been taught and the way you see the structure of Canada, you don't operate in your rights and freedoms as a human being, but as a legal person. And there's a very big difference. Now, when you understand the distinction, you begin to see who you are. That changes you a lot. I'm not talking about finances or money. The international bankers, the IMF bankers, and I could start to list a whole bunch of names here. Even people that I may know personally, they don't really care about knowing about their rights and freedoms. They're never really going to grasp the full effect that it has upon your heart and upon your spirit to understand what's been going on. Why have you been yoked? Why have you been placed in a position of servitude, and what you can do to change this situation? There's a whole bunch of people that all they care about is dollar bills and money. And for them, human rights and freedoms has only to do with what can I get out of this in my pocketbook or in a material aspect, and not in a spiritual or a physical aspect for your own self. And it's sad, because throughout the law, yes, there is finances attached to it. Yes, there is a monetary freedom attached to it. But throughout the law, you begin to understand and express how were you supposed to be without people making demands on you, without people creating liabilities upon you, without legal persons creating liabilities upon you. It's wonderful. We all walk around right now, if you will, with burdens that others have placed upon us. And not others in our family because they're sick or they're in a troubled situation. Burdens that's been placed upon us by this system. by the system itself. And these burdens, we're not supposed to be carrying them. We were created by whoever you believe created you. He didn't say, okay, I'll create you, or if nature created you, if that's what you believe, and place you here, and now pick up all these burdens of this artificial system and try to function with them. It's ridiculous. But as a legal person, that's all you're carrying, are burdens. And what's worse about them, the burdens that you're carrying, you pay for them through privileges and rights. However, we were meant to be free. That's why through all the law that you see here in operation of Canada talks about your fundamental rights and your fundamental freedoms being here in operation for you. And if they're not listed and if they're not qualified, don't worry about it. They still exist in Canada. They've existed before and they will always exist. The only difference is what they've done is they've hid them and they don't allow you to see them. All these human rights and freedoms, all these fundamental rights and freedoms that are expressed in the law, such as the Canadian Bill of Rights and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Article 5 and Article 26, that state that, listen, there are certain rights and freedoms enumerated herein, but there are other ones out there available for you to go and use, if you can see them and operate under them. These are obligations expressed, and they're outrightwardly expressed. These are contract obligations that the government owe to you, without getting too difficult into the terminology of all this. In the Emergencies Act, you see it specifically expressed. In the Manitoban Human Rights Code, you see it expressed. They tell you the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the international covenants. They express that these are obligations that they must fulfill. Well, these obligations that they must fulfill, this is where you're getting your fundamental rights and freedoms from. This is where you can draw your fundamental rights and freedom from. Outside or a part of all what Canada has created. And inside of what Canada has created, you don't find what you will find by looking exterior, by searching for your rights and freedoms exterior. If you stay within the context of what's been created here, all you will find is a pointing to your rights and freedoms through these covenants and obligations. But they won't actually express it in the laws themselves. You have to see it and now appropriate it for yourself. And it starts by education. It starts by learning your rights and freedoms. Can you imagine if we had a whole province of people demanding their rights and freedoms? For example, recently in Montreal, there was apparently over 100,000 students that protested against educational increases to their tuition fees. And education is free, and it should be free, according to the International Covenant of Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. We, as men and women, are entitled to have education for free, because they recognize the fact that education, if you don't have it, it creates discrimination. It creates ignorance. It creates a country that is divided, not united, and it creates a country that has poverty in it and bigotry in it. That's what they declared. So they said that in order to put a stop to this, we will grant education for free. All types of education. And the state parties that were signatories to these covenants, including Canada, they were under obligation to put operations of law into existence that education would be free, even higher education. And they never fulfilled their obligation to you as a human being. What they did is they created systems for legal persons and declared in these systems that these are rights and freedoms that we will give to you if you pay for them. However, in these covenants, as men and women, human beings, we have been granted and we have the right to, if you will, appropriate or take or get an education unto the highest level at the expense of, if you will, of those who are holding on to the resources of Canada. Those who are extracting the resources and taking away our natural resources, well, they are supposed to foot the bill for our educational purposes. However, they don't. They put the money into their bank accounts. They put the money into a few of their bank accounts, and then they go and spend it on themselves or on parties. But your rights and your freedoms are here in existence in Canada. And once you start to understand them, they're actually not that hard to fight for and acquire. It's just starting to invest your own time, your own energy into making a change for yourself, for your family, and perhaps, who knows, for the future of Canada.